The smell of rust and wet earth still clings to her words, even decades later. Evelyn Hart spoke only once about what happened on that Wisconsin farm in 1957, and her testimony vanished into the shadows of classified files before most people even knew her name. But voices like hers, they echo in places where silence was supposed to reign forever. December 4th, 1957. A date that appears in no official records, mentioned in no newspaper headlines, acknowledged by no government agency. Yet, somewhere in the basement archives of Quantico, buried beneath layers of bureaucratic dust and deliberate forgetting, sites a manila folder marked only with a case number that leads nowhere, and a woman's trembling voice captured on magnetic tape that was never supposed to exist. Before we continue, if you can still hear my voice, it means you haven't looked away. Subscribe now, not for entertainment, but to see what others are too afraid to know. The farm sat 17 miles outside Plainfield, Wisconsin, where the cornfields stretched endlessly toward a horizon that seemed to swallow light itself. Local maps from that era show nothing but empty acreage, but federal land records tell a different story. One of sudden purchases by shell companies, of government vehicles arriving under cover of darkness of neighbors who asked too many questions and found themselves relocated with generous compensation and strict non-disclosure agreements that their children still honor today. This was the heart of America's Cold War paranoia, where the fear of communist infiltration had reached such fevered heights that any technique, any sacrifice, any violation of human dignity seemed justified in the name of national security. The CIA's MK-Ultra program was consuming millions of dollars and countless lives in its desperate quest to unlock the secrets of the human mind. What they discovered in those farmhouse basements would make the horrors of Nazi medical experiments seem almost quaint by comparison. Evelyn Hart was 23 years old when she stumbled through those cornfields, her dress torn and stained with substances the FBI lab reports would later classify as inconclusive. She had been missing for 6 days. 6 days that, according to her family, stretched into an eternity of searching, of questions met with bureaucratic silence, of local police who seemed more interested in discouraging the search than conducting it. Her disappearance had been systematic, calculated with the precision of a military operation. Hart had been traveling from Milwaukee to Madison to visit her sister, a routine trip she had made dozens of times before. She waited at the Plainfield bus station, reading a magazine, when 2 men in dark suits approached her. Witnesses later described them as unremarkable, forgettable, the kind of men who seemed to dissolve from memory even as they were speaking to you. The men showed Hart some form of identification and spoke quietly to her for several minutes. Security cameras at the station, which should have recorded the entire interaction, mysteriously malfunctioned during precisely those minutes. Hart walked with the men to a black sedan parked outside, got into the back seat voluntarily, and vanished from the official world as completely as if she had never existed. The Cold War had taught America that some truths were too dangerous for daylight. MK-Ultra was still in its infancy, but the appetite for understanding the human mind, for breaking it, reshaping it, controlling it, had already consumed entire budgets and swallowed countless lives. What happened to men like Frank Olson, who fell from a hotel window after unwittingly consuming LSD during a CIA experiment, was becoming disturbingly common. But Evelyn's case was different. Evelyn survived. The transcript of her testimony exists in fragments, recovered from a filing cabinet that was supposed to have been destroyed during the Church Committee investigations of the 70s. Water damage had made portions illegible, and what remained read like the fevered confession of someone who had glimpsed hell and somehow found her way back. FBI agent Thomas Morrison, who conducted the interview, noted in his preliminary report that Hart displayed signs of severe psychological trauma, but maintained an unsettling clarity when describing specific details of her ordeal. She spoke of the farmhouse first, described it in a voice that Morrison noted as unnaturally calm, almost dissociative. The house stood 3 stories tall, painted white but peeling, with windows that reflected nothing during the day and glowed with a sickly yellow light after dark. The basement, she said, extended far deeper than any basement had a right to go, connected to tunnels that seemed to stretch for miles beneath the Wisconsin earth. The architecture of the place defied conventional understanding. Corridors that should have led to exterior walls instead opened into vast underground chambers filled with equipment that hummed with electrical energy. Rooms within rooms, each one designed for a specific type of torment, connected by ventilation systems that carried the screams of test subjects from one end of the facility to the other. Hart described lying in her cell and listening to the sounds of drilling, of electrical discharge, of human voices that gradually ceased to sound human at all. The men who brought her there wore no uniforms, carried no identification, spoke in accents she couldn't place. They moved through the facility with the casual efficiency of people who had performed these same actions countless times before. Hart noticed that they avoided eye contact with each other, as if the work they were doing required a form of psychological compartmentalization that made normal human interaction impossible. Morrison, his notes describe Hart's testimony about the first night in clinical terms that somehow make the horror more vivid. She was placed in a room with concrete walls and a single bulb that flickered in patterns she began to recognize as deliberate. The sound of machinery hummed constantly from somewhere below, punctuated by voices that seemed to speak in languages that hurt her ears to hear. She wasn't alone in that place. Other rooms held other people, and sometimes their screams would echo through the ventilation system like prayers no God would answer. The lighting system throughout the facility operated on schedules that bore no relationship to natural day and night cycles. Hart described periods of absolute darkness lasting what felt like days, followed by harsh fluorescent illumination that made sleep impossible. The temperature fluctuated wildly, from stifling heat that made breathing difficult to cold so severe that her breath formed clouds in the air. These environmental manipulations, she realized, were not random but carefully calculated to destabilize her sense of time, place, and physical reality. Food arrived at irregular intervals, consisting of tasteless paste that contained substances she could not identify. Sometimes the paste made her feel drowsy and compliant. Other times it produced hallucinations so vivid that she could not distinguish them from reality. The water they gave her tasted metallic and left her mouth feeling numb for hours afterward. Every aspect of her physical existence had become a variable in someone else's experiment. The experiments began on the second day. Hart described them in fragments, her memory apparently damaged by whatever cocktail of drugs they had administered. Electroshock therapy administered without anesthesia. Sensory deprivation chambers where time became meaningless. Drugs that made reality liquefy and reform into shapes that violated every law of physics and sanity. But it was the surgical procedures that haunted her testimony most deeply, described in a whisper that the recording equipment barely captured. They were cutting into brains, she said, not to heal, but to explore, to map, to understand what happened when certain regions were stimulated or destroyed. The screaming from the surgical suite would continue for hours, sometimes days, before falling silent forever. Bodies were removed under cover of darkness, transported away in unmarked vehicles that left no tire tracks on the carefully maintained gravel roads. Hart described watching through a small window in her cell door as gurneys rolled past in the corridor outside. The bodies on those gurneys were sometimes still moving, sometimes still conscious, their eyes wide with an expression of terror so profound that it seemed to linger in the air long after they had passed. She never saw the same person twice. The supply of test subjects seemed endless, drawn from sources she could not imagine. The lead researcher, whom Hart knew only as Dr. Brennan, spoke with the casual detachment of a man dissecting insects. He was tall, thin, with hands that never seemed to stop moving, and eyes that reflected light like a nocturnal predator. His accent was European, possibly German, though he claimed to have been born in Ohio. The other staff called him Doctor, but Hart noticed they avoided looking directly at him when they spoke, as if his presence caused them physical discomfort. Brennan moved through the facility like a man conducting a symphony of suffering. He would visit each test subject daily, reviewing charts and making notes in handwriting so precise it looked like machine printing. Hart observed him through her cell door window, watching as he consulted with technicians, adjusted equipment settings, and made decisions about dosages and procedures with the methodical efficiency of someone following a well-established protocol. What disturbed Hart most about Brennan was not his cruelty but his complete absence of emotional response to the suffering around him. He exhibited no sadism, no anger, no satisfaction at the pain he was causing. He simply existed in a state of clinical detachment that seemed to preclude any recognition that his test subjects were human beings rather than laboratory specimens. Brennan's particular interest lay in what he called threshold experiences, moments when the human mind approached complete breakdown but somehow held together. He would subject test subjects to combinations of psychological and physical trauma designed to push consciousness to its absolute limits, then document their responses with the methodical precision of a scientist studying bacterial cultures. Hart described watching him take notes while a woman in the next room screamed for 17 consecutive hours before her voice simply stopped functioning. The theoretical framework underlying Brennan's research drew from multiple disciplines that should never have been combined. He had studied the work of Nazi doctors who had experimented on concentration camp prisoners, learning techniques for manipulating consciousness through trauma and deprivation. He had incorporated research from Soviet scientists who were exploring the use of psychoactive drugs for interrogation and control. Most disturbingly, he had developed his own theories about the nature of human identity that treated individual consciousness as nothing more than an electrical pattern that could be recorded, manipulated, and transferred between different biological systems. Hart became aware of Brennan's ultimate goal gradually, through overheard conversations and fragments of documentation she glimpsed during medical examinations. He was not simply trying to control minds or extract information. He was attempting to map the precise neural pathways that generated what he termed the illusion of individual identity, with the ultimate objective of achieving complete consciousness transference between human beings. The breakthrough, according to Hart's fractured memory, came on the fifth night. Brennan had been working with a technique he called consciousness transference, attempting to map the precise neural pathways that generated what he termed the illusion of individual identity. Using a combination of experimental drugs, electromagnetic stimulation, and surgical intervention, he believed he could effectively transfer memories, personalities, even souls from one body to another. Hart became his primary test subject for this procedure. She described being strapped to a metal table in a room that hummed with electrical equipment while Brennan prepared injections that glowed with an unnatural phosphorescent light. The drugs, when they entered her bloodstream, felt like liquid fire that burned away everything she had ever known about herself. Her memories became liquid, flowing and reforming like mercury, mixing with thoughts and experiences that belonged to other people, other lives, other times. The process began with what Brennan called neural mapping. Electrodes attached to Hart's skull recorded the electrical patterns generated by different memories and emotional states. The data was fed into a computer system that seemed impossibly advanced for 1957, filling banks of magnetic tape with patterns that represented the complete electrical signature of human consciousness. Hart could hear the machines working, processing her thoughts and memories into data that could be stored, analyzed, and potentially reproduced. For hours that felt like years, Hart existed in a state between consciousness and death, aware of multiple identities occupying the same neural space. She remembered being a child in situations she had never experienced, speaking languages she had never learned, knowing things about the world that she should not have been capable of knowing. Most disturbing were the memories that belonged to the other test subjects, their final moments of agony and terror now permanently etched into her own consciousness. The foreign memories came in waves, each one accompanied by sensory experiences so vivid that they temporarily overwhelmed her own identity. She experienced the childhood of a man who had grown up in rural Georgia, complete with the taste of his grandmother's cooking and the sound of cicadas on summer evenings. She lived through the final moments of a woman who had been subjected to some form of surgical procedure, feeling the cold metal of the operating table and the precise pain of instruments cutting into her brain. Most disturbing were the memories that seemed to contain knowledge she should not have possessed. Technical information about the facility's construction, details about other government installations, names and faces of officials who operated in the deepest levels of the intelligence community. This information arrived not as data, but as lived experience, as if she had personally attended briefings and walked through secure facilities that she had never actually visited. But something went wrong with Brennan's procedure. Instead of successfully transferring consciousness, something far more unpredictable occurred. Hart's mind, instead of breaking under the assault, began to absorb and integrate the foreign memories while somehow maintaining its core identity. She became a repository for the experiences of everyone who had died in that place, their final thoughts and memories preserved in neural pathways that defied every understanding of how human consciousness functioned. The integration process was not passive absorption, but active synthesis. Hart's consciousness began to organize the foreign memories, creating connections and patterns that revealed the true scope of what Brennan had been attempting. She could see the complete organizational structure of the research program, understand the theoretical framework that guided the experiments, and recognize the systematic nature of the horror that surrounded her. Through the memories of previous test subjects, Hart learned that the Wisconsin facility was not unique. Similar installations operated in remote locations across the United States and in several foreign countries, all connected by a network of researchers who shared data and techniques. The consciousness transference experiments had been conducted on hundreds of subjects over a period of several years, with a success rate that Brennan considered acceptable given the revolutionary nature of the research. If you're still here, it means you're one of the few who search for truth in the dark. Subscribe, because stories like this don't stay online for long. The equipment began to malfunction. Lights flickered and failed throughout the facility. The constant hum of machinery became erratic, punctuated by sounds that seemed to originate from the building itself, groaning, weeping, whispered voices that spoke in languages from centuries past. Brennan's careful scientific detachment cracked as he realized that something beyond his control was occurring. Hart described her escape in terms that suggested she wasn't entirely responsible for her own actions. The restraints holding her to the table simply opened, though no one had touched them. The locked doors throughout the facility stood ajar, as if the building itself had decided to release her. She walked through corridors filled with shadows that moved independently of any light source, past rooms where equipment sparked and failed, where test subjects who should have been unconscious sat upright and stared at her with eyes that reflected understanding they should not have possessed. The other prisoners, Hart realized, were helping her escape. Not physically. Most were beyond such capabilities, but through some form of consciousness that transcended the limitations Brennan had assumed were absolute. The memories he had tried to transfer and manipulate had become something else entirely, a collective awareness that existed in the spaces between individual minds and had finally grown strong enough to act. As she moved through the facility, Hart became aware that she was not alone in her body. The consciousnesses of the other test subjects accompanied her, guiding her through corridors she had never seen, warning her away from areas where staff members were still active, sharing knowledge about the facility's layout that no individual person should have possessed. The escape was not the desperate flight of a single prisoner, but a coordinated effort by dozens of minds working in perfect synchronization. She reached the surface as dawn was breaking, emerging from the farmhouse basement into a world that felt impossibly bright and clean after 6 days in that underground hell. Behind her, she could hear alarms sounding, voices shouting, the roar of vehicles starting. But she also heard something else. The sound of equipment destroying itself, of electrical systems overloading, of a building that had contained too much suffering finally refusing to contain any more. The destruction of the facility was systematic and complete. Hart watched from the edge of the cornfield as windows exploded outward, as smoke poured from ventilation systems, as the carefully maintained facade of scientific respectability collapsed into chaos. The sounds of suffering that had echoed through those corridors for months were replaced by the roar of flames and the crash of collapsing structures. The FBI found Hart walking along Highway 10 approximately 30 miles from Plainfield, her clothes torn and stained, her eyes focused on something no one else could see. Agent Morrison noted in his report that she seemed unnaturally calm for someone who claimed to have endured 6 days of torture and experimentation. Blood tests revealed the presence of numerous unknown compounds in her system, substances that the laboratory technicians could identify but not explain. More disturbing were the psychological evaluations. Hart demonstrated knowledge of classified government programs that she should never have heard of, spoke fluent Russian despite having no education in foreign languages, and could describe in precise detail the interior layouts of government facilities she had never visited. When questioned about these abilities, she would simply state that she remembered things that had happened to other people, as if memory itself had become transferable between human minds. The psychological testing revealed abilities that bordered on the supernatural. Hart could accurately predict the behavior of people she had never met, demonstrate technical knowledge in fields she had never studied, and access information that seemed to come from sources outside her own experience. Most disturbing was her apparent ability to know things about the personal lives and classified activities of the government officials who interviewed her, knowledge that she claimed came from the memories of previous test subjects who had been exposed to those same officials. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the psychiatrist assigned to evaluate Hart's mental state, reported that traditional psychological assessment tools were inadequate for understanding Hart's condition. Her patient displayed none of the typical symptoms of trauma-induced dissociation, yet clearly existed in a state of consciousness that included multiple distinct identity patterns. Chen's final report, heavily redacted in the declassified version, concluded that Hart represented something entirely new in psychiatric literature, a functional integration of multiple consciousness patterns that maintained individual identity while demonstrating collective awareness. The official investigation into Hart's claims lasted exactly 17 days before being transferred to a classified division that operated without congressional oversight. Agent Morrison's files were sealed, his team reassigned to different cases across the country, and Hart herself disappeared into a witness protection program that officially did not exist. The farmhouse outside Plainfield burned to the ground 3 weeks later in what local fire officials described as an electrical fire of suspicious origin. But the story didn't end with the flames. Federal agents continued to monitor the site for months afterward, using equipment designed to detect radiation, electromagnetic anomalies, and other phenomena that had no official explanation. Local residents reported strange lights emanating from the burned foundation, sounds of machinery operating beneath the ground, and an unusually high number of electronic devices malfunctioning within a 5-mile radius of the former farmhouse location. The cover-up operation, designated Project Mindbridge in documents recovered during the church committee investigations, involved the systematic destruction of evidence, the relocation of witnesses, and the dissemination of false information designed to discredit any accurate accounts of the events. Newspaper editors received phone calls suggesting that stories about the Hart case would be detrimental to national security. Medical professionals who treated Hart were transferred to remote assignments or found their careers suddenly stalled by administrative complications. Dr. Brennan himself vanished from the historical record immediately following the incident. His personnel file, when finally declassified in 1994, contained only basic biographical information and a notation that his employment had been terminated for reasons related to national security. Colleagues who had worked with him claimed no memory of the man, as if his very existence had been systematically erased from their consciousness. The technology Brennan had been developing, the consciousness transference techniques that had apparently malfunctioned so catastrophically, disappeared with him. But whispers persisted within the intelligence community of similar experiments continuing at other locations, conducted by researchers who had learned from Brennan's mistakes and developed more sophisticated methods of controlling the human mind. What makes Hart's case particularly disturbing is the pattern it established for subsequent intelligence operations. The techniques of systematic memory manipulation, consciousness fragmentation, and identity dissolution that Brennan pioneered would resurface in declassified documents from programs conducted at facilities like the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, where Dr. Ewan Cameron used electroshock therapy and sensory deprivation to literally erase patients' personalities and rebuild them from scratch. The parallels between Hart's testimony and the experiences described by Cameron's victims are impossible to ignore. Both involved the systematic destruction of individual identity through a combination of drugs, electrical stimulation, and psychological trauma. Both resulted in subjects who demonstrated impossible knowledge and abilities that suggested their consciousness had been fundamentally altered. And both were covered up through a network of institutional denial that persists to this day. But Hart's case went further than Cameron's experiments. Where Cameron sought to control individual minds, Brennan appeared to be attempting something far more ambitious: the complete transfer of consciousness between bodies, the creation of artificial collective awareness, the violation of the most fundamental boundary between self and other. If Hart's testimony is accurate, he may have briefly succeeded. Evelyn Hart lived for 37 more years after her testimony, relocating frequently and maintaining a deliberately low profile. Those who knew her in later life described a woman who seemed to carry the weight of multiple lifetimes, who spoke occasionally of dreams that belonged to other people who displayed an uncanny ability to understand the thoughts and motivations of complete strangers. She worked as a librarian, a clerk, a night security guard, always jobs that required minimal human interaction and left few traces in official records. Her employment history reveals a pattern of brief tenures and sudden resignations that suggest she was either unable to maintain normal social relationships or was being systematically relocated by handlers who wanted to prevent her from developing long-term connections. Co-workers described her as intelligent but distant, helpful but somehow disconnected from the immediate reality of her surroundings, as if she were listening to voices that no one else could hear. Hart's personal journals, discovered after her death, contain references to ongoing contact with the consciousnesses of the other test subjects from the Wisconsin facility. She wrote of conversations with people who had died decades earlier, of shared dreams that provided information about events occurring in distant locations, of a collective awareness that continued to exist in some form outside the boundaries of individual biological death. Her final testimony, recorded just days before her death in 1994 and discovered among her personal effects, suggested that her ordeal at the Wisconsin farmhouse had never truly ended. The consciousness transference procedure had created permanent neural pathways that continued to receive information from sources she could not identify. She described experiencing the deaths of former intelligence operatives, scientists, and government officials as they occurred, their final memories somehow transmitted directly into her awareness across thousands of miles. Most disturbing was her claim that the other test subjects from Brennan's experiments had never truly died. Their consciousness, she insisted, continued to exist in a state between life and death, trapped in neural patterns that had been artificially created and somehow sustained beyond biological death. She could still hear their voices, she said, calling out from a place that existed somewhere between memory and reality, begging for a release that might never come. The final entry in Hart's personal journal, discovered after her death, consisted of a single sentence written in handwriting that forensic analysts could not definitively identify as hers. They are still waiting for someone to remember their names. Below this, in what appeared to be different handwriting, were listed 17 names of individuals who had no official connection to Hart or to any government program, but whose deaths between 1957 and 1994 had all been classified as unexplained by the investigating authorities. Investigation into these 17 names revealed a disturbing pattern. All had been associated, however peripherally, with classified research programs. All had died under circumstances that investigating officers described as suspicious but were unable to explain. And all had been found with expressions that witnesses described as peaceful, as if they had finally found the release they had been seeking. The implications of Hart's testimony, if accurate, suggested that the consciousness transference experiments had created something unprecedented in human experience, a form of technological haunting that violated every understanding of life, death, and the nature of human identity. Government responses to these claims remained classified, but internal memos suggested that research into consciousness manipulation continued well into the 1980s, conducted at facilities whose locations remain unknown to this day. Modern neuroscience has begun to explore concepts that echo Brennan's theories: the possibility of uploading human consciousness to digital formats, the potential for transferring memories between brains, the nature of identity itself as a construct that might be more malleable than previously assumed. But the researchers pursuing these avenues work within ethical frameworks designed to prevent the kind of horrors Hart described, protocols that exist specifically because of what was learned from cases like hers. The burned farmhouse site outside Plainfield was eventually sold to a development company that built a shopping center on the location. Employees and customers at the various stores report an unusually high incidence of electronic malfunctions, inexplicable sounds emanating from the basement areas, and a general sense of unease that seems to intensify during the winter months when the Wisconsin landscape most closely resembles the desolation Hart described in her testimony. Local police receive regular calls about disturbances that investigating officers invariably describe as unfounded, though their reports often note atmospheric conditions that defy explanation. Security cameras malfunction with suspicious frequency. Cell phone reception becomes spotty within a specific radius of the former farmhouse location, and sometimes late at night when the shopping center is closed and empty, security guards report hearing sounds that seem to originate from beneath the concrete foundation, the distant hum of machinery that no longer exists, voices speaking in languages that hurt to hear. Share this before it disappears, and subscribe, not to follow, but to remember, because some truths only survive when someone keeps them alive. The truth about what happened at that Wisconsin farmhouse in 1957 remains buried beneath layers of classification that show no sign of being lifted. Hart's testimony, fragmentary and possibly distorted by trauma and experimental drugs, represents the only first-hand account of events that officially never occurred. But her words, preserved on magnetic tape that was never supposed to survive, continue to echo through the corridors of intelligence agencies and research institutions, a reminder that some forms of knowledge come at prices too terrible to calculate. Perhaps that's why Hart's story matters, not because it provides definitive answers about government experiments or consciousness manipulation, but because it serves as a warning about what happens when the boundaries of human experimentation are crossed. In a world where technology increasingly blurs the line between mind and machine, between individual and collective awareness, between life and death itself, Hart's testimony stands as a testament to the costs of unchecked scientific ambition. Local cemetery records show that Hart was buried in an unmarked grave, her funeral attended by 3 individuals whose names do not appear in any official documentation. The cemetery groundskeeper later reported that electronic equipment near her gravesite experienced regular malfunctions, and that visitors to the area often complained of hearing whispered voices speaking in languages they could not understand. The magnetic tape containing Hart's testimony remains in a vault beneath Quantico, filed under a classification level that ensures it will never be released to the public. But copies exist, hidden in private collections and safe deposit boxes, preserved by individuals who understand that some stories are too important to let disappear completely. These copies are passed down through networks of researchers, journalists, and activists who recognize that the line between historical fact and deliberate fiction becomes dangerously thin when governments decide that certain truths are too dangerous for public consumption. And sometimes, late at night in research facilities around the world, scientists working on projects involving consciousness memory and the fundamental nature of human identity pause in their work and wonder if they're walking down a path that someone else has already traveled. They wonder if the ethical frameworks they operate within are strong enough to prevent them from becoming the next Dr. Brennan. They wonder if the boundaries between progress and horror are as clear as they'd like to believe. Most of all, they wonder if Evelyn Hart was telling the truth. Some stories were never meant to be told, but now that you've heard it, there's no way to unhear it.